Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. Where today we're Bach in Black. Oh God, the puns are horrible. Because it was on this day in 1969 that the world was taken by storm by the album Switched on Bach. Now, what was this album, and why would an album ostensibly of classical music really take the pop music world and the rock music world and the avant-garde music worlds by storm, or simultaneously? And the reason for this, did I say 69? I meant 68. So this was released in October of 68. With that proviso for you ultra geeks out there taken care of, let's talk about the reasons that this album was so important. Interesting instruments that deviated from the norm were becoming increasingly prevalent in the 1960s. The mellotron and its predecessor, the Chamberlin, were already on the radio at this time. Look at what the Moody Blues were doing with the mellotron. Look at what the Beatles were doing with it, what the Stones were doing with it. The big name bands. And so people were getting used to that. The studio trickery that was becoming increasingly prevalent, which in a way started with Frank Zappa's Freak Out and the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds and later Sergeant Pepper and Piper at the Gates of Dawn, was ushering in an era where people were becoming acclimatized. They were getting used to guitars not necessarily sounding like guitars, pianos not necessarily sounding like pianos, because studio effects and various sonic manipulation techniques were becoming more sophisticated. But the idea of the full scale synthesizer, the full modular synthesizer, being able to produce not just sound effects, not just sort of flourishes here and there, but fully fledged music. This was an idea that people weren't necessarily warm to until this album came out. Because what this album was were incredibly well known pieces by Bach, including the Third Brandenburg Concerto. Are on a G string. The list goes on. Some of his most well known works, but played all on the Moog synthesizer with nothing else. And this was really revelatory because when you listen to this album, it doesn't sound like some sort of proto MIDI type of thing. It doesn't sound comical or parody. It sounds like a fully fledged, sonically interesting, sonically inviting, sonically approachable and listenable version of these great Bach tunes. And one of the other reasons that I think it was important to do this with Bach is because audiences had already, by the 20th century, and frankly before that, got used to hearing Bach on instruments that weren't really around or prevalent or in their current form in his day. Bach composed primarily for organ and also for harpsichord. And later on, it would be played by things like the clavichord and the piano, and the modern version of the harpsichord, which was quite different than the one of Bach's day. And of course, modern pipe organs that were much more dynamic and had much more of a variety of sound. And this showed that Bach's music could really become important to people, irrespective of the instrument on which it was played. I mean, today it's probably most common to hear Bach played on the piano, which wasn't any instrument that Bach composed for. Versatility. So, in keeping with that tradition, Bach's music was played on the synthesizer, and it was played by the musician Wendy Carlos, who played all of the pieces, did all of the arrangements, and really made a big splash. The album sold well. People, from a technical point of view, were obsessed with it, and it really became something that took the world by storm, and that sent a very important signal to the wider world that from here on out, it's sort of the synthesizer has the stamp of approval from the musical community. Because if it's good enough to be the lead instrument, the only instrument on an album of serious Bach music, then it's certainly going to be perfectly acceptable for it to be played on a pop album, which wasn't obviously thought of in the same style of Bach. So I definitely recommend that you listen to this album. album. It was really, really important. There was, of course, a sequel in 1973 based on the same notions, but it was really this original that set the world on fire and paved the way for all of these interesting synthesizer experiments and the integration and normalization of synthesizer into all genres of music, which took place very shortly after this album was released. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.